A few years ago, I was driving through the middle of nowhere in Montana, headed out to visit my dad, when I see this guy standing at the side of the road. He had his thumb out like he was trying to catch a ride, and I could see that he had military fatigue pants and some kind of military baseball cap. You know the kind, some kind of insignia on it, and unit info too. I mean, I don't know too much about the military, but I got the sense that the guy was a vet, so I decided to do him the service of giving him a ride. So I pass him, pull over just ahead of him, and give him a wave out of my open window to let him know to get in. As he gets closer and closer to the car, I keep my eye on him in the rear view, watching him dragging these two heavy-looking bags along the road before he opens up the back of my car and tosses them in. He looked a little rough around the edges, and didn't smell too good either, so I figured that he might have been homeless or something, or was in the process of moving across the country to start a new life, or whatever he had planned. But then after getting in my car and swapping a little small talk, I ask him if he had served, and he replies, "No, not a day in my life." All of his other answers were real cold and uninterested, and that's when I realized that I might have actually made a huge mistake in picking this guy up. I was making a lot of nervous small talk, just trying to break the ice and get some conversation going, but after a while, it didn't seem like I was breaking the surface, so I just shut up and kept driving. Then, after maybe 10 or 15 minutes on the road, I start getting curious as to what he's got in his luggage. The cases were huge and obviously stuffed with something, seeing as it took him a lot of effort to lug them into the back seat. So I ask him, "What you got back there, buddy?" For the first time since he got into the car, he actually turns his head to look me dead in the eyes. Then he just says, "It's none of your business." I'm a little creeped out by this, because for the first time, it occurs to me that he was in possession of something that he definitely shouldn't have been carrying. But on the other hand, I'm not exactly a small guy, and when it comes to physical confrontation or a shouting match, I was pretty confident that I could hold my own. So instead of just letting it go and carrying on the drive, I decided to confront him on it. I asked him again, making it clear that I wasn't just making small talk, and that I really did want to know what he'd just brought into my car. I figured that he was just sensitive about his situation, but as much as I'm okay with a little charity, I don't appreciate having my security compromised. So if he got his feelings hurt by me probing about his past, so be it. But again, he just turns to me and says with more emphasis, "None of your business." At that point, I just hit the brakes, and the first thing I notice is that the guy reaches for his belt. He doesn't grab anything, he just reaches, and I knew then that I was in way more danger than I ever could have anticipated. I tried to keep as cool as possible, as I told him that he needed to get out before I called the cops. I told him I'd give him a chance, and not call if he just got out and made himself someone else's problem. I knew that was a fair offer, but whether or not he was going to accept it depended entirely on how desperate he was. There was a chance he could just shoot me, kick me out, drive my car for miles before anyone was alerted, and by that time, it'd be way, way too late for me. I saw his hand move to his belt again, and I could tell that he was actually thinking through it for a second, but then by some divine intervention, he thought better of it and agreed to get out. As he pulled his stuff out of my back seat, I kept my eye on him the whole time. I don't think he was a killer. The bag certainly didn't smell like a dead body or anything. Not that I know what one smells like, but they certainly didn't smell bad, to put it that way. He didn't even really seem like a bad guy, I guess, but whatever he was caught up in, it was something that I wanted absolutely no part of. As I said, I kept my eyes on him as he took his bags. Then after he slammed the door shut, I put pedal to the metal and just got away from there. I've picked up a fair few hitchhikers in my time, and I always do my best to do right by people who need someone to do right by them. But that little encounter was definitely a rude awakening for me, and I learned that it's not all small talk and sing-song when you pick up a stranger at the side of the road. Many, many years ago now, years before I was even born, my dad was driving through Arizona when he spotted a guy hitchhiking at the side of the road. He said it was a real scorcher that day, 100 degrees in the shade kind of deal, and there's this guy with no hat and no water bottle just walking along this desert road. Being the all-around great guy that he is, my dad pulls over and offers him a ride, claiming that there was no way the dude would have made it out of the valley without getting some serious heat stroke, probably. The guy seems incredibly grateful. He jumps in the car and they take off down the road. My dad asks the guy where he's headed, and the guy replies, next town over, before chugging from a bottle of water my dad offered him. They commenced a little small talk as they drive, and the guy tells him some common first name like Tom or Dave or something. Turns out the guy had been hitchhiking all the way across the state because he wants to cross into Mexico on account of his 90-year-old abuelita who was sick, and he wanted to see her before she passed on. The fact that he didn't have any money wasn't going to stop him either. He wanted to be at her bedside when she passed. My dad thought that was just about the sweetest thing he'd ever heard, and the hitchhiker looked like a real hard guy too, I guess you'd say. So it was extra touching seeing how you'd never really expect that from him. But everyone loves their grandma, I suppose. They ended up driving together for way longer, and they worked out which point my dad would be farthest south using an old road map so the guy could get out as far south as possible so he wouldn't have much further to go. He gets out, and my dad wishes him luck, and then he goes driving on his merry way. Some way down the road, a cop car appears in my dad's rear view, puts on its lights, and pulls him over. Like a model citizen, my dad pulls over, hands at 10 and 2, then asks the officer what the problem was. The cop doesn't say anything. He just asked to see his license. He took a good long look at the license, then told my dad to get out of the car. My dad then gets out of the car, and the cop starts searching around it for a while before closing the driver's side door and walking back over to him. The cop asks him if he picked up a hitchhiker a few miles back, and my dad says yes. The cop then asks if his name was something other than Dave or Tom, some Hispanic name, and my dad says no, that it was the plain common name that he'd been given. The cop then produces a photograph, and the guy in the picture is none other than the hitchhiker my dad had just spent the last hour or so with. When my dad says yes, that was the guy he just picked up, the cop told him he needed to follow him to the closest precinct to answer a few questions, because the guy wasn't some dedicated grandson headed to see his abuelita. He was wanted for the murder of a cop, and he was fleeing the country. The cop told my dad that the guy would have killed him for his car just as soon as look at him, and that he'd probably have taken him hostage if they performed a traffic stop on his vehicle while Mr. Abuelita was still in the car. Knowing how close he'd been to danger really shook my dad up. He was only in his 20s at the time, early 20s too, still naive and stupid brave enough to just randomly pick folks up. Says the whole thing really changed his perspective on people, and he was much more cautious afterwards. Glad he was too. Otherwise, I might not even be here to tell this story for him. Rest in peace, Dad. Your kind, generous, silly self is missed infinitely. Back when I was in my late 20s, I ended up dating my all-time biggest crush. Her name was Jamila, and I thought that she was the prettiest girl in our whole secondary school, but by the time we all got off to uni, she was nothing short of stunning. We stayed connected on Facebook, but it wasn't like we kept in touch regularly or even at all. So I just kind of watched and admired her from afar, wishing a girl like that was in my league. But then, during the summer that I turned 28, I ended up drinking at some swanky bar as a part of a friend's birthday drinks, when who do I see but Jamila? I'd undergone something of a glow-up since then, having lost some weight and toned up during junior officer training in uni. The whole experience changed my life, and being more confident and way more athletic, I found talking to girls and securing dates to be a whole lot easier. I wouldn't say that I was some Lothario, but I could definitely handle myself. Yet when it came time to seeing my old crush like that, and then actually getting the chance to talk to her, my game went totally out of the window. But then somehow, between catching up and some casual small talk, we actually started to have a bit of chemistry. And then before long, we're straight up flirting while agreeing to meet up for a drink sometime. I couldn't believe it. I was a living embodiment of that dumb Walking on Sunshine song, and that feeling lasted almost 6 weeks of dating until the affair suddenly turned sour. Then, on our final date, and I don't want to bore you with the details, but what should have been just a minor disagreement turned into one heck of a confrontation. I was no saint myself, but the girl of my dreams turned out to be a complete psycho. And to cut a long story short, I just walked out of her apartment after she hit me with a lamp. I was drunk, angry, and upset, wearing nothing but a thin shirt in winter weather, but I just needed to be out of there for everyone's safety. I didn't stop to think that if I tried to walk home, I'd be freezing my butt off, and by the time I did, the cold had sapped what was left of my outdated iPhone's battery, and I was looking at a 3-mile walk in near freezing weather. Needless to say, it took just a few minutes for me to start sticking my thumb out at passing cars, mainly just cabs at first, but not a single one was empty or had its lights on. After that, it was all of them, as I actually got a bit worried that I'd end up as one of those drunks who ends up dying of hypothermia or something. Car after car zoomed past me, with no one stopping, and at one point, I even held out a 20-pound note to try and entice someone into stopping, but then realized how daft that was. Eventually, right as I thought that I might have to jog home in my dress shoes in order to keep from freezing, I see this lonely car coming down the road towards me, and even though I was already resigned to jogging, I stuck my thumb out for one last chance. To my complete surprise, the driver put the car's indicators on, pulled over to the side of the road, and then beeped the horn as if to say, "We'll get in then." I couldn't believe my luck. It was like a proper Christmas miracle, and when I looked into the open window to see who had been kind enough to stop for me, I saw a familiar face. It was one of my old uni mates, a bloke named Liam, and having only driven back into town to see his family around Christmas time. And he says, "I thought that was you. Hop in." And so I did. We drove for about 10 to 15 minutes back towards my place, just chatting the whole way. Now Liam had been driving all day and had just rolled into town when who does he spot at the side of the road, standing there in a bloody dress shirt like a plonker, but yours truly. It was a really pleasant surprise, and the latter half of the drive was spent with me pouring my heart out about the roller coaster relationship that I was in. It really did seem like a Christmas miracle in that respect. He was exactly what I needed, exactly when I needed it. He gave me all this great advice, throwing in bits of lived experience from his own life, and we agreed to go for a pint or two around the New Year so we could carry on with our catch-up. And then, out of nowhere, a car smashed into the driver's side door and sent us spinning out of control. I know it sounds a bit cliched to say it all happened so fast, but that's exactly how it was, and how it is. I remember we drove through an intersection on a green light, and then I was blinded by some headlights, and we got hit. I'm not sure that I even have the words to describe what the kind of impact feels like. It felt like it wasn't just the car that got hit. Some kind of force hit me too, so that all I could do was close my eyes and hold on for dear life. It was only when we came to a total stop that I opened my eyes, and I couldn't believe the amount of damage the impact had caused. The front windshield was almost shattered, looking like it was barely hanging on, and the driver's side dash was all crumpled up. But then the next thing I noticed was that there was smoke coming out from underneath the bonnet, and this proper rush of fear goes through me as I realized the car might actually catch fire or something. And that's when I turned to Liam, telling him to get out of the car if we can before it blows up or whatever I saw in movies, and I can just tell right away that he's dead. There was blood all over him. His face is gone, and there's blood coming out of his mouth, and his one good eye is wide open and just completely still. He was definitely not breathing, so I just got myself out of the car, limped over to the curb as far away from the car as I could, and then basically just waited until the emergency services showed up. I got checked out by some paramedics at the scene, and they ended up taking me to the hospital so some doctors could run some tests on me. I think apart from a bit of whiplash and a few cuts and bruises, I definitely was okay. But they kept me overnight because I was in shock and the police needed to talk to me anyway, so it just made sense to make me an inpatient. I officially found out that Liam had died the next morning, but as I might have mentioned, I already knew. Seeing the condition that he was in after the crash, I just knew that there was no chance of him surviving, so there wasn't this moment of me getting the bad news and being devastated by it. Instead, I just sort of nodded as the hospital staff went through the motions. They knew that I knew. I mean, I had been in the bloody car with him, but they still had to officially announce Liam's passing to me after I'd spoken with police officers. The first interview was the start of a lengthy and extremely distressing legal process that ended in the driver of the other car going to prison for manslaughter. He'd been drinking after an office party and had been driving way too fast and decided to completely ignore a red light on account of how quiet the roads had been. And somehow, fate put us right in that guy's path at the perfect moment to destroy our lives. He cried his way through the whole court case, pled guilty to everything, and had some prepared statement for the family saying how sorry he was and how he wished it was him who died instead. It all fell on deaf ears, though. I know some people can be incredibly forgiving over stuff like that, forgiving their child's killer out of some sense of Christian duty, I guess. Liam's parents, though, they weren't like that at all, and neither was I. The way we saw it, he was a murderer. Even after all the anti-drunk driving ads that have been clogging up the TV and radio around Christmas for years and years and years, this fella thought, nah, it won't happen to me. That alone makes him a murderer, not just an arrogant idiot who killed someone by mistake. And I hope he suffers for what he did for the rest of his life. As crazy as it sounds, one of the most dangerous and terrifying few moments of my life passed me by without me realizing what was happening. I just started 4th grade, so I was either 9 or 10 years old, and my family lived right at the end of a street that was just over half a mile long. I used to hate walking up and down that thing, and you can call me lazy if you want, but it's true. It was 5 minutes of boring nothingness every time I walked for the school bus or my mom sent me to the corner store. So, this one time, Mom sends me to the store to pick up flour or eggs or something. The walk to the store, it looked like it was going to rain, and by the time I had walked out of the store, goods in hand, it was raining like you wouldn't believe. Looking back on it, I probably could have just ran there and back again, but I've always been incredibly lazy, so hard knowing that. Instead, I ran to a bus shelter right in front of me, refusing to walk home until the rain had at least mellowed out a little. I shared a nice lady's umbrella for a block or two, but she soon changed course for me, and I ended up stuck under the shelter in front of this beauty parlor, real close to where our street started. If I committed to the walk, I was going to get drenched, and I also remember not wanting to get whatever it was my mom wanted wet in the rain, so instead of walking, I decided to stick my thumb out at passing cars. I was old enough to understand that sticking your thumb out like that was magically what made people give you a ride, and it took a while to get someone's attention, but in the end, I did. This older-looking car, which seemed like it was heading down the street, suddenly slowed down, then parked just after the bus shelter I was taking cover under. I was pretty sure the driver had pulled over for me. Like I said, it slowed and stopped right when I started frantically thumbing in their general direction. But then, when I ran up to the passenger side and tried to open the door, I found it was locked. I tried again in quick succession, pulling a little harder, but it still didn't open. I then looked up through the window and saw that the driver was looking at me with this kind of freaked out look on his face. And that's when it popped into my head that he might not have been pulling over for me at all. I kind of take a step back, thinking I might have made a mistake, then the guy rolls down his window and asks me if I wanted to ride. He then unlocks the door, I climb in, and we take off down the street. The guy driving was a middle-aged white guy. He seemed pretty nice, and when he asked me where I was getting out, I told him just a few blocks down the street. We literally didn't say a word to each other. Then the next thing I knew, I hear the whoop-whoop that a cop car sound makes, and that's when blue and red flashing lights began behind us. I'd been in a car that had been pulled over by the cops before, and I remember my dad getting really annoyed at it. But the guy I hitched a ride with didn't seem to get annoyed. He seemed frightened again, and in turn, that made me kind of nervous too. Anyway, the guy pulls over, and when we come to a stop, he tells me, "I think you should walk from here." I've been in a traffic stop before, but I didn't know that under no circumstances should you get out of the car. Luckily, I didn't, but not because I knew I shouldn't, just the selfish reason that I didn't want to have to walk home in the rain. So the cop walks up, tells the driver the reason for stopping him, which I honestly can't remember, and then asks for his driver's license. My heart kind of dropped whenever the driver told the cop that he didn't have his license in the car, and not only that, but he didn't have any kind of paperwork with him whatsoever. I don't know why exactly, but the cop didn't seem to think that that was an issue, and just asked for the guy's name instead. I noticed this weird kind of hesitation in the guy's voice. He said his first name, then his second name, then said another name, then started jabbering about something until the cop interrupted him to ask if I was his kid. But then the guy was like, "Yeah." And that's the first time I noticed something was actually off. The guy could have been forgetful, nervous, just straight up shy or whatever. But when he told the cop that I was his kid, I knew that that was straight up a lie, my dude. I wasn't scared or anything. I wasn't about to leap out of the car, and it was still raining really heavy, and I wanted the ride I earned. Dumb, entitled way of looking at it, I know. It was just a more innocent time like that, I guess. So the cop goes back to his car, presumably to run the guy's details, and I'm hoping I can get a ride home once we're free to leave. I asked the guy this because I really don't want to get out of the car, only the guy doesn't reply at all. He's just sitting there, white-knuckling the steering wheel, which makes me even more nervous, but for different reasons entirely. I swear to God, there was a split second where I thought this guy was about to just take off. He kept looking around, hands going back and forth between the wheel and his thighs. And that was the nervous that I got, thinking the whole thing was going to end up in some crazy police chase. But out of pure nervousness, I asked the guy again if I can still get a ride home once we're done with the cop, and he gives me this really anxious look and says, "You need to get out of the car." Before I can even answer, the cop comes back, opens up the driver's door, then really rudely tells him to get out of the car. The driver is now visibly shaking, and I'm wondering what's going on. And as he really reluctantly gets out of the car, the cop grabs him by the arm, drags him out, yells at me to stay in the car, and slams the door closed. I'm freaking out, wondering what's going on. And by that time, I actually want to get out of the car and run back to my house, but I'm so scared I just stay put in the car and do as I'm told. I wait and wait and wait, and nothing happens. But I don't realize at the time that the driver is not going to be returned to the car. The next thing I know, the cop opens up the driver's side door so he can lower the window, and then he closes it again. He then leans down and asks me if I knew the man who was driving, and truthfully, I shake my head, no. The cop nods, then asks for my name and address, then follows up by asking why I got into the guy's car in the first place. Again, I tell him the truth, and that I was hitchhiking because I didn't want to walk home in the rain. And again, the cop nods before telling me to stay put a little while longer. I'm not sure how long went by, but eventually, another cop appears and tells me that he's going to give me a ride home, so I should follow him to his car. This is the best news I had in a long time by this point, so I'm just happy as I swap cars and drive home safe and dry. But then, when we pull up, this other cop explains that he wants to talk to my mom and dad just to explain why he had to give me a ride home. I'm not exactly about to tell him no. I'm in way too good a mood for that, so I let the cop follow me inside so he can talk to my mom. As you can imagine, my mom was pretty surprised to see a cop standing behind me when she opened the door. And after being reassured that everything was fine, Mom told me to go up to my room so she could talk to the cop in private. In my mind, the whole ordeal is over. I'm not in trouble for being late and everything is fine. Only, things were not fine. Not for my mom downstairs, who's having to listen to the full, unedited version of what had actually happened. And I didn't find out the truth until many, many years later. The man whose car I'd gotten into on that rainy afternoon was a registered offender. One who was out on parole after serving however many years for inappropriately touching children. I had offered myself up to this freak on a silver platter, and it was only a freaking broken taillight or something that saved me from God knows what. When I think back to how twitchy the guy was when the cop went back to run his name, I think he was actually weighing up the possibility of just zooming off with me in his passenger seat. I get that he already told me to get out, but that was probably his one last chance to save his bud, and that above anything else he wanted to, I don't know, do stuff to me. I guess that's why he was so apprehensive about letting me in his car in the first place. If he got pulled over, the cops saw the kid in his car after running his plates and stuff, that he'd probably end up going straight back to jail. I guess that's what creeps me out so much. The guy knew his freedom was at stake, but he couldn't seem to stop himself. He just couldn't resist the compulsion to follow his most evil instincts, like he was just wired to be a predator like that. Like I said, for years I had zero clue how much danger I'd been in, believing I was entirely unconnected to the guy being dragged out of his car like that. I thought I'd done something wrong, and that's why my mom suddenly was all super strict all of a sudden. She was stuck with this secret for years, correctly figuring that I wouldn't be able to handle it if I knew the truth. I can barely handle it now, and if I ever have kids, I'm gonna give them the stranger danger talk as soon as they're able to understand it. Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. During the early 1970s, a series of young women began to disappear from the area surrounding San Francisco Bay. Each of the women were high school to college aged and were believed to have been hitchhiking at the time of their disappearance. One by one, as their butchered bodies were recovered, local law enforcement were faced with the grim possibility that they were dealing with a serial killer. The search for the women's murderer culminated in a horrifically grisly crime, only for the perpetrator to suddenly turn themselves in. Over the days that followed, his name would be printed in every major newspaper in America, as the public learned of the shocking depravity of one Edmund Kemper. Ed was born just north of LA on December 18th of 1948. His father was a war veteran who helped test nuclear weapons during peacetime, while his mother, Clarnell, was a decidedly dissatisfied housewife who would often complain of how meager the family's finances were. Her attitude and demeanor made a strong impression on young Edmund, who remembered growing up with a distinct contempt for her. By the age of 4, Ed weighed an impressive 30 pounds and was considerably taller than other children his age. He also seemed acutely aware of his superior size and used it to bully and intimidate other kids in some frightening displays of antisocial behavior. Ed later said that by the age of 10, he was experimenting with the torture of animals and once buried a cat alive before mounting its head on a spike. When accused of such monstrous behavior by his parents, Ed managed to lie his way out of trouble and was said to have derived an intense amount of pleasure from the successful deception. Knowing he could simply lie his way out of trouble, Ed continued to murder small animals and began taking trophies from his kills until his furious mother uncovered his stash. Ed learned to hide his darker inclinations from his overbearing mother and would sometimes steal his younger sister's dolls before acting out mock mutilation on them. This same sister would later notice that an alarming amount of her dolls would turn up decapitated, but could never prove that Ed was responsible. She also recalled that Ed used to make her play a game called Gas Chamber, where he would demand to be tied to a chair before asking her to flick on an imaginary switch. Upon doing so, Ed's sister would watch him as he feigned violent seizures, saying he took an intense delight in imagining the suffering of those executed. Ed was close to his father, and the relationship was probably the one thing which could have kept him on the straight and narrow. However, when Ed was just 9 years old, his parents went through a vicious divorce, and instead of being housed with his father as Ed would have preferred, his mother gained full custody. In a bid to forbid his father from seeing him, Ed's mother moved the family to Helena, Montana, where her neurotic behavior and rampant alcoholism resulted in physical and psychological abuse. It must have made for an odd picture, to say the least. At 14, he was 6 feet and 4 inches tall and towered over his mother as she led him to the basement to be locked up for the night. He could have disobeyed and overpowered her with ease, yet the sheer terrifying force of her personality turned someone very capable of violence into a gentle giant. Clarnell once told Ed that he reminded her of his father and that no woman would ever love him. She later told his father that she refused to show him any kind of affection out of fear that it would turn him gay. Ed once described his mother as a sick and angry old woman who made her home such a hellish environment that he fled back to California at age 14 with the goal of living with his father. Yet when he arrived in Van Nuys, Ed discovered that his father had remarried and was caring for a young stepson. Although he couldn't afford to care for the boy, Ed's father promised to keep him away from his mother and arranged for him to stay with his paternal grandparents near North Fork, a small mountain town in the foothills of the Sierra Nevadas. Edmund hated living in such a tedious rural area. Instead of giving him a chance to mellow out, the isolation only exacerbated his growing psychosis. On August 27th of 1964, a 15-year-old Ed was sitting at the kitchen table with his grandmother, Maud, when the pair began to bicker. The petty squabble soon intensified until the pair were full on screaming at each other when Ed suddenly stormed out of the kitchen and ran upstairs to his bedroom. Maud simply assumed that Ed was done arguing, so much so that when he returned with a small caliber hunting rifle, she didn't seem in the least bit afraid. Maud Kemper's final words on the earth were, "You better not be shooting birds again, Ed." But Ed didn't intend to shoot birds that night, and he relished the look of shock on his grandmother's face as he aimed the rifle at her head and fired. Ed went about mutilating his grandmother's corpse with a kitchen knife, then later executed his grandfather following his return from grocery shopping. Realizing that he had murdered both grandparents in a fit of violent rage, Ed then contacted the local police and simply waited to be arrested. He told police officers that he just wanted to see what it felt like to kill Grandma, and that he killed his grandfather so he would not have to suffer the heartbreak of finding out that his wife was dead. Authorities were horrified at Ed's crimes, who couldn't comprehend why such a young boy would kill his own grandparents. In light of that, he was declared criminally insane and was sent to Atascadero State Hospital, a maximum security psychiatric hospital that houses mentally ill convicts. However, upon his arrival, hospital staff were confused to find that Ed was far more lucid and coherent than their other patients. One doctor said that Ed showed no flight of ideas, no interference with thought, no expression of delusions or hallucinations, no evidence of bizarre thinking. Ed showed all the signs of an intelligent and thoughtful person, testing high in IQ tests while getting along with patients. In essence, he was a model prisoner. Yet Ed had a secret. When safe from the eyes and ears of the hospital staff, Ed would question the other inmates on the nature and methods of their crimes. By conversing with a variety of murderers, home invaders, and offenders, Ed had given himself a crash course in violent and deviant crime, and by the time he was released on his 21st birthday, he was even more dangerous than before he was incarcerated. Ed was released into the car of his mother on December 18, 1969, who by that point was living in Aptos, California. Every so often, Ed met with psychiatrists for a series of probation interviews. His final report read as follows: "If I were to see this patient without having any history of him, I would think that we were dealing with a very well-adjusted young man, free of any psychiatric illnesses. He's had an excellent response to the years of treatment and rehabilitation, and I would see no reason to consider him to be of any danger to himself or to any member of society." The report resulted in Ed's juvenile records being completely expunged, meaning there was nothing to warn potential employers or wider society that the young man in front of them had murdered his own grandparents. Ed's parole required him to attend community college, but he soon grew bored with the experience and applied to be a police officer. Despite being rejected due to his size, Ed maintained friendships with several Santa Cruz police officers and was a regular at a cop bar named the Jury Room, where he was known as Big Ed. After quitting community college, Ed worked at a number of low-paying jobs while staying with his mother. Neighbors would later recall savage arguments between the two, with Ed himself later saying that, "My mother and I had horrendous battles. I have never been in such a vicious verbal battle with anyone. It would go to fists with a man, but this was my mother, and I couldn't stand the thought of us fighting. It was mostly over stupid things. I remember one roof raiser was over whether I should have my teeth cleaned." Ed moved out as soon as he was able to, but the joy of escaping his mother was hampered by severe financial difficulties. Yet just when it looked like he might have to move back in with his mother, Ed won the equivalent of $90,000 in a civil lawsuit following a traffic accident. He was now a young, independently wealthy psychopath, and now that his money troubles were over, his mind had time to focus on other things. While driving around in the 1969 Ford Galaxy that he bought with a part of his settlement money, Ed began fixating on the large number of female hitchhikers dotting the highways and byways of Northern California. Times had changed since Ed had been locked up, and he was a stranger to the concepts of world peace and free love. While folks his age were preaching brotherhood and understanding, Ed was a predator who wanted nothing more to inflict pain, suffering, and death. Ed began storing plastic bags, knives, and handcuffs in his car, then conducted a series of dry runs where he picked up and dropped off hitchhikers without harming them. But by May of 1972, the urge to kill was overwhelming, and on May 7th, Ed picked up two 18-year-old college students named Marianne Pesci and Anita Lucchesa. After taking about an hour to drive out to a suitably secluded location, Ed forced Mary and Anita into handcuffs, then stabbed them both to death. He then put both bodies into the trunk of his car, then drove back to his apartment. Records show that during the ride home, Ed was stopped by a police officer for having a broken taillight. He was such a sociopath that he displayed no hint of fear or anxiety in the presence of the officer, and the pair conducted a polite and jovial exchange before Ed respectfully accepted his ticket. Once he was alone with the girls' bodies, Ed stripped and photographed them before cutting them into pieces. He then dumped the girls' dismembered corpses near the Loma Prieta mountain. A few months later, on the evening of September 14th, Ed spotted a 15-year-old dance student by the name of Aiko Ku, who had decided to hitchhike home from her dance class after missing the bus. Ed picked her up, drove her to a remote location, then after murdering her, stuffed her body into the trunk of his car. He then drove over to a small bar to enjoy a few beers, all while the body of a 15-year-old lay lifeless in his trunk. Ed then disposed of Aiko's body in the same way he had with his first hitchhiker murders, then began plotting his next kills. By January 7th of 1973, Ed was back living with his mother. This was obviously a huge source of stress for him, and it's believed he sought a victim in order to blow off some steam. He picked up 18-year-old Cynthia Ann Shaw from the Cabrillo College campus, drove her to a wooded area, and shot her in the head with a .22 pistol. After disposing of her corpse with a power saw, Ed kept Cynthia's severed head for several days, then buried it in his mother's garden facing upward toward her bedroom. After his arrest, he stated that he did this because his mother always wanted people to look up to her. Just a few weeks later, following yet another heated argument with his mother, Ed went looking for another victim. By this point, terrified students were well aware that they were being preyed upon and were advised to only accept rides from cars with university stickers on them. But since Ed's mother worked for the University of Santa Cruz, he was easily able to obtain one, and in doing so, secured the trust of 23-year-old Rosalind Thorpe and 20-year-old Alice Liu. After executing each of them, he dismembered and dumped their bodies around Eden Canyon, both of which were recovered the following month. Ed was later asked why he liked to decapitate his victims so much, and he replied, "The head trip fantasies were a bit like a trophy. You know, the head is where everything is at. The brain, eyes, mouth. That's the person. I remember being told as a kid, you cut off the head and the body dies. The body is nothing after the head is cut off. Well, that's not quite true. There's a lot left in the girl's body without the head." Finally, on the night of April 20th, 1973, Ed's mother woke him up after arriving home drunk from a party. Ed waited until his mother was asleep, then crept into her room with a claw hammer and bashed her head in while she was asleep. To speed up the process of her demise, he cut her throat with a penknife, then set about decapitating her with a much larger bladed implement. Ed then used his own mother's severed head as a dartboard, taking breaks only to scream obscenities at it. When Ed had exercised all the hatred and rage he felt for her, he cut out her tongue before smashing her face in with a claw hammer. After storing his mother's corpse in a closet, Ed went for a few beers at a nearby bar, but then upon his return home, he telephoned his mother's friend, 59-year-old Sarah Hallett. Under the pretense of his mother being on vacation, Ed invited Sarah over to have dinner and watch a movie, but after inviting her inside, he strangled her to death. Ed killed Sarah for no other reason than to create a cover story that she and his mother were away on vacation together. Then he packed up his car and drove all the way to Colorado, expecting to be the subject of a serious manhunt. However, after failing to hear news of his mother's murder on national radio stations, Ed found a phone booth and called the police himself. He confessed to the murders of his mother and Hallett, but the police did not take his call seriously and told him to call back at a later time. A short while afterwards, Kemper once again called the Santa Cruz police, only this time, he asked to speak to an officer he knew by name. After again confessing to the murder of his mother and Sarah Hallett, Ed then waited for the police to arrive, and upon his capture, He also confessed to the murders of the 6 hitchhiking students. After his trial began on October 23rd of 1973, 3 court-appointed psychiatrists found Kemper to be legally sane. One of the psychiatrists, Dr. Joel Fort, relayed to the court that Kemper had engaged in cannibalism, saying that Ed had sliced flesh from the legs of his victims, then cooked and consumed these strips of flesh in a casserole. Despite such claims, Dr. Fort determined that Kemper was legally sane and was fit to stand trial for the murders. On November 1st, Kemper took the stand testifying that he killed the victims because he wanted to own them, like possessions. He also claimed that 2 different beings inhabited his body, and that when the killer personality took over, it was kinda like blacking out. On November 8th, 1973, the 6-man, 6-woman jury declared Ed guilty on all counts. He asked for the death penalty, requesting death by torture, but instead received 7 years to life for each count, to be served at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville. Today, Ed is free to mix with the general prison population and is considered a model prisoner. During his time in prison, Ed has participated in a number of interviews which have contributed to the understanding of the mind of serial killers. FBI profiler John Douglas described Ed as among the brightest prison inmates he's interviewed, one capable of rare insight for a violent criminal. Douglas also added that he actually enjoyed Ed's company, calling him open and sensitive with a good sense of humor. In these interviews, Ed is open and honest regarding the nature and motives of his crimes, and he's expressed a desire to prevent people like himself from committing crime in the future. There's somebody out there that is watching this and hasn't killed people but wants to. They need to talk to somebody about it, Ed was quoted as saying. They have to trust somebody enough to sit down and talk about it because it can't be stopped easily once it starts. To this day, Ed is still imprisoned at the California Medical Facility, but he is next eligible for parole in the year 2024. Ed has been repeatedly denied parole in the past and has even waived his right to a hearing on one occasion, but maybe 2024 will be his year. Maybe Ed's reputation as a model prisoner will allow him to spend his twilight years in the comfort of his own home. But in the words of prosecutor Ariadne Simmons, we don't care how much of a model prisoner he is because of the enormity of his crimes. Ed might act like a polite and affable gentle giant, but make no mistake, the man is a monster. I picked up 2 hitchhikers in 10 years, and either they're all cursed or I'm super unlucky. But either way, never again. The first was this really cute girl I figured I could maybe vibe with on the road to Fresno, and for a while, everything was going great and I was thinking we could maybe swap numbers or something. But then, she asked if she can smoke. There was nowhere to pull over right away because we were right in the middle of the highway, so I asked if she could wait a few minutes. She says no, then insists on climbing into the back seat so she can smoke. I tell her to at least open a window because apparently she couldn't wait, then I go back to focusing on driving. I then start smelling this really gross smell, like way different than cigarettes, even with the window open, and I look in my rear view to see that she's sucking on a freaking meth pipe. I freak out and tell her to stop, but by that point she's high as a kite, telling me to shut up and laughing at me. I'm still freaking out and I demand that she stop smoking meth in the backseat of my car, and she ends up hitting me from the back seat. It got so bad I thought that I was going to cause a crash or something, and luckily I was able to get her out under threat of calling the police. There was no big disaster or anything, but that puts me off stopping for hitchhikers for quite a while. Now the next time was this guy holding a sign saying, "Need a hospital, can't afford an ambulance." I pull over, check him out to see if he's for real, and he seems to be in a pretty bad way, so I tell him to hop in. We're making some small talk at first, and he seems a little woozy, but not dying or anything. But then, about 15 minutes into the drive, the guy starts taking a turn for the worse. He's sweating, holding his stomach, telling me he feels like he's gonna puke, but we're maybe like 2 minutes away from the hospital, so I keep telling him to hold it down for just a few more minutes. We get there and he opens the door to my car, then just pukes up blood all over the concrete outside. I'm freaking out, kind of asking like, bro, you good? And he takes about 2 steps towards the hospital before just collapsing and going into seizures right there before my eyes. People rush out of the hospital, put the guy on some stretcher. It was like something out of a movie. Sadly, I think the guy did die. Maybe if someone is super hurt, I'll give them a ride, but after those two, I think I have a fear of hitchhikers from now on. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.
So every morning I drive over to Stone Mountain from Atlanta for a jog around the 5-mile loop as a bit of a warm-up. Then I would sprint up the mountain once or twice to finish off. There was only one rocky part of the mountain cleared for going up and down, and it was the less steep side of the mountain, near the main entrance, that is. That time of the morning there was either nobody else or there was maybe like one other person. One morning, I'd been on the loop and was about a mile or two in. This was one loop with a mountain in the middle, and there was no shortcut or alternate way back. And a white van with no windows drives by kind of slow. I took note of that, of course, but keep going as it was my only option. A while later, the van comes back around from behind again, and I started to get seriously alerted because I hadn't seen anybody else out there at that point, and I was pretty well out in the middle of nowhere. The van drives past and disappears around the curve, but then comes around towards me even slower. I was good and scared at that point and started to run a good bit faster and tried to make myself look tough and menacing as I ran. The van kept going past without stopping, so I tried to talk myself into just it being a maintenance worker or something and thanked my lucky stars that everything was okay. Well, it wasn't okay, and about a minute later the van had turned around and came back up behind me again and pulled up just ahead of me and stopped as I was running towards it. I was trying to quickly figure out what the heck to do and had to come to a stop when I saw the back doors of the van fly open towards me. I knew that I couldn't outrun a van in either direction, so I immediately decided my only option was to sprint up the mountain as fast as I could and hope to outrun them. Being so used to running up the mountain daily and seeing how easily I blew past other people not used to going up it every day, I figured that I had a good shot at outrunning just about anybody. So I busted my butt up the rocky, woody, thick-brushed mountain as fast as I could. This person took after me, but I did not look back once. It was really hard. There was no clear path, and I had to dodge stuff and run in jagged directions to get away. I heard him behind me for what seemed like about maybe a minute, and then I didn't hear anything after that. I still didn't look back, just kept busting upwards as fast as I could. I got to the top, checked my scrapes, and caught my breath before rushing back down the cleared path and back to my car. I never saw anyone else or the van after that, although I was scared to death and on high alert until I got into my car. There was a welcome center down near the entrance, but at that time it just wasn't open. This was before cell phones as well, so I got in my car as fast as I could and I headed back home feeling so lucky and fortunate that I was able to get away that day. I didn't go back there in the mornings anymore after that and didn't go back for a while afterwards out of fear. But when I finally did start going back, I always took pepper spray and didn't start going out until later in the day when there were others out there as well. I have no idea what was up with that guy or what he was going to do to me or trying to do, but still, all these years later, I can't come up with anything feasible that wasn't likely to be seriously bad, or, who knows, maybe would have ended my life. Also, he never said anything, he just chased me. I did call the police when I got home and told them what happened, and they just took a note of what I reported, and that was it. After that, I never heard anything else. So, this just happened last night. My boyfriend, our husky, and I embarked upon our long holiday road trip to see our families earlier today. 14 hours of this trip takes place on a major US interstate highway. We were looking for places to make our last gas stop and found a place just off the highway. We pulled off and into the desolate gas station and immediately were greeted by a fairly large, somewhat sketchy man taking not so subtle glances in our direction. We were both sort of joking that maybe we chose the wrong gas station, and boy, we did. My boyfriend suggested that while he pumped the gas and run to the restroom that I take our dog and let him stretch his legs. Being a city girl, I know to always carry my mace and phone, especially at night, and so we diverged as I started to make my way towards the ill-lit side of the gas station, and my boyfriend to the restroom. I made it not even 30 feet from my car and was approached by a small chihuahua, sort of mutt with a collar, who happily greeted our husky. I looked around for an owner while the two dogs got to know one another and continued to walk to a patch of grass with our new follower in tow. My first instinct was to help the dog and find the owner, but in the back of my mind, something just felt very off, to be honest. It felt off since the moment that we pulled in fact. I immediately called my boyfriend and told him that I'd found a dog and said, "Hey, I found a dog, but something is weird." He immediately abandoned his bathroom break and came out to meet me. While I'm standing with our dog and this dog who came seemingly out of nowhere, I felt eyes on me from the employees working outside. My boyfriend expresses concern about the dog being loose so close to a major highway and further looked around for its possible owner. He approached one of the employees who was changing out trash liners right next to our car for some time now. He asked the employee if he had any idea whose dog this was. In perfect English, he replied, "I don't speak English," and anxiously turned around to only continue to go through the motions of changing out a trash liner that he'd been standing at this whole time. He then continued to watch us chase around this dog until the dog led us behind the store or gas station. With my boyfriend 5 feet behind me, I followed the dog to the back of the store. And behind the store, 10 or so big rig trucks sat largely in darkness, resting for the night. Cardboard boxes and broken wood pallets covered the dirt. A large man in a gas station uniform greeted me, staring through a glass door. With my boyfriend out of view, I bent down to check the dog's tag as the man continued to stare. My boyfriend approached, and that's when the man behind the glass door's demeanor completely changed. Almost dejectedly, he opened the glass door. I quickly asked, "Do you know whose dog this is?" Nervously, he fumbled his words and replied, "Yeah, that's my dog." We both exhaled and exchanged a look as if to say something about that was really weird. We made our way back to the car, and my boyfriend remembered that he still had to use the bathroom, so I settled back into our locked car. And when my boyfriend got back to the car, he told me the same man that we talked to at the back of the store followed him to the bathroom and stood behind him, just watching. I think that's when we realized just how creepy and surreal the last 15 minutes had been. As we drove away, we discussed the strange and creepy series of events, how the whole thing felt staged or set up. I mean, why did the employee act like he didn't know the dog when it belonged to his coworker? We immediately Googled the small town we had stopped in and discovered that apparently it has been a hotspot for human trafficking, and in recent months, as much as 60 people had been arrested. Was this just a string of eerie coincidences, or was there something way more sinister going on here? So this is a little story from when I was growing up in northern Kentucky in the 90s. I would have been around 10, I think, maybe a little bit older, but I'm in my 30s now, and I vividly remember this happening, and I still think about it all the time. So my best friend lived with his grandparents for a bit on several acres of land in Walton, Kentucky, and I spent almost every weekend there. They never really did much with the land. It remained relatively cleared, but there were no farms or structures on it. They had a horse stable near the house, but that was it. And my friend, he'd received a go-kart for his birthday, so we were out driving it around on the open land. It was just the two of us, and we were having a blast riding this thing around. It was getting pretty close to dusk, and we knew that we were going to have to pack it in pretty soon. We came to a stop, and the engine cut out, and almost at the same time, both of us had this really strange feeling come over us. We just felt like we were being watched by something. It's weird how our lizard brains can still even process something like this, but we both agreed that there was just this weird overbearing feeling. We hadn't heard his grandpa's truck, and we were too far out to be seen from the house, so we started looking around. We were in an open field in the middle of their land, and it was surrounded by trees and tall brush, but something caught my eye first, and I got my friend to look in that direction. In the brush, we could see a long, almost black shape sitting very still. Now, I know at this point in the story, most of you are thinking Bigfoot. I can say that I just remember things being dead silent. Even now, I sometimes wonder if it was something else that we saw, but all I remember is thinking that it was a giant, and I mean huge, black wolf. I would guess that it was maybe 200 feet away from us, trying my best to remember. And it was sitting perfectly still, like not even moving an inch. But to me anyway, it looked sort of furry. I couldn't make out any other features like ears or eyes though, but I swear this was what was making us feel watched. It was like when you see a cat getting ready to pounce. That was what it felt like we were looking at. We were both getting really spooked by this point. The sun was going down behind the tree line now, and one of us was going to have to jump out and pull start the engine back up. We were whispering about it, what was watching us. Honestly, I forget which one of us jumped out to and started the cart back up, but when we looked back at where the black shape was, it was gone. The go-kart didn't have lights either, so we just drove as fast as we could back to his grandparents' house, and we told them what we saw. His grandpa said that we probably just saw a coyote or maybe a boar or something, but this shape, man, was long and low, and it was huge, and I don't know, a coyote just doesn't sit well in my head with what I saw. Not to mention, too, that it was like pitch black and furry, which was weird. Anyway, every few years I think about this story, and I've read that there are no wolves in Kentucky anymore anyway. I think that I've just convinced myself that it was a coyote or something, but the memory has stuck in my head all this time for some reason. Nothing else ever happened on his grandparents' land aside from a really bad car accident a few years later and some missing chickens. Again, coyotes would explain all that. And every once in a while, the horses would get really riled up at night, but we would go camping on his land and fishing a lot, and we had a lot of fun around there and never saw anything ever again. Anyway, this is my short little spooky story, and I wish it had a bit more to it, but it's 100% what happened. I found this place and thought that I would share this, and again, it may have been a run-in with a wolf, a coyote, a boar, or who knows, maybe Bigfoot. But whatever it was huge, and it scared the daylight out of us. I'm in my early 20s and female, and about 9 months after I had moved into my place, someone started pounding at my door a little past 11:30 p.m. I was already in bed by this point and was awfully concerned about this person at my door. My upstairs neighbor's aquarium had actually broken the night before, and it was flooding into my living room. Since I had had that fiasco with my neighbor late at night, I figured that It was probably just her again, and almost just opened the door without hesitation. But right before I opened it up, I had this horrible feeling just wash over me. So instead, I meekly said, "Hello?" through the door. I heard a man reply saying, "Hi, I'm a friend of David Jones." And the second that I heard him speak, my blood went cold. I had a terrible feeling about this. David Jones, obviously not his real name, was the name of the previous tenant, and he was a very elderly and disabled guy. He was in a wheelchair and lived with a helper, and he'd passed away before I had moved in. I looked at the people, and he was wearing sunglasses. Again, it was almost midnight, but then I noticed that he had a black face mask, a black hoodie with the hood up, and I said, "Sorry, but David doesn't live here anymore." He pounds his fist on my door again and laughs, saying, "Oh yeah? Open the door and prove it." Like I said, David was in a wheelchair and needed a ramp for the door, which was removed before I ever even moved in. I also drive a motorcycle, and my immediate neighbours don't drive any particular wheelchair-accessible vehicles. With all of this in mind, you would think that someone who feels comfortable enough with David to be knocking down his door in the middle of the night after at least almost a year of no communication would be able to evaluate the situation and see that there are no wheelchair modifications, apologize for the mix-up, and be on their merry way. Well, unfortunately, this wasn't the case. He was still pounding at the door and telling me to open up, and I told him that David wasn't here. I'm not opening the door, and he needs to leave now. He stood outside my place for a few more minutes. I was scared and stood there frozen by the door. Eventually, I saw him walk away, and I was still by my door when I heard someone rustling around by my back door over near where my bedroom is. I was still frozen. I didn't want to believe that someone could actually be by my bedroom window. For clarification, though, the area by my window, it's attached to a common area yard for all of the residents. It's directly off the sidewalk of a relatively busy area, so it isn't completely uncommon to have someone in the yard, but it is certainly uncommon to have someone directly up against your porch and the windows. I had heard something loud happen in my bedroom. I grabbed my pepper spray and cautiously approached the room. No one broke in, but something still seemed really off. After a while, I hadn't seen this person anywhere, so eventually I went back to bed. In the morning, I came out for a smoke, and I saw that my bedroom window screen had been ripped off. It was all bent out of shape and definitely didn't look like it just randomly fell off, and I knew exactly what had happened at that point. That guy ripped off the screen and tried to get in through the bedroom window. Thankfully, it was locked, and I have window jammers, so there was no way that he was going to get in. This obviously frightened me a lot, but there really wasn't much that I could do at this point. Anyway, a few weeks later, someone tried to open my front door in the middle of the day. No knocks, no nothing. I just heard my door clearly trying to be opened. I quickly shot up and ran to the peephole to see a man dressed all in black, hood up with black sunglasses on. He tried the door a couple more times and pushed against it really hard. I was trying to think of something intimidating to say or something to get him to stop. My brain decided that it was a great idea to just hit my door. And surprisingly, it worked though. So I slapped the back of my door really hard, and the guy jumped up 3 feet and just ran away. Now, here is where I think things get just really bizarre. So I googled my address, and everything online for my current residence still lists David Jones and the active resident, and I 100% think that that guy saw me, a young female, all alone, and googled my address and was trying to get my trust into opening this door. I think that after that didn't work, he was still trying to get in, and hence the bedroom window. Him coming back a few weeks later is very weird in my opinion. You would think that he would have either moved on to another target, or perhaps would have been much more interested in getting in sooner. I definitely don't think that he knew David. I don't think he owed him money or was family or anything like that. So the timeline is really strange, but maybe he already had other victims and just decided to try my place again. At any rate, his plan didn't work and he was gone. Literally, months go by, and then someone knocks gently at the door around 9 p.m. one night. I got up to look, and what do you know? An individual covered in black head to toe with sunglasses on. I didn't answer or make any noise. He slowly turns the door handle and pushes on the door again, then takes a few steps back and walks to my neighbor's door. I heard him try theirs. My neighbor is a middle-aged man living alone. The door didn't open, and I see him walk up the stairs and can hear him trying yet another neighbor's door. This apartment has 5 people living in it, including a child. That door didn't open, and he tried the remaining door that didn't currently have anyone living in it. Failure yet again. The whole situation was just really weird and creepy. So that makes me think that maybe he didn't single me out as a vulnerable female because he just seems to be trying to get into anywhere that he can, really. I do think that it's rather strange, though, that my cats hate this guy. I have never seen either of them hiss except for when this guy was at the door. They always are clearly very frightened and are ready to fight, which is majorly unlike either of them. You honestly wouldn't even know that they have teeth or claws unless you have a cardboard box or a laser pointer or something. They're just big sooks. But with this guy, they just completely change. Anyway, back in early January, our clad in black lad is back. My brother, who looks quite intimidating, was over for a visit. He heard someone try to open my door. He got up, opened the door to see this guy actively trying to open my middle-aged neighbor's door, and this guy just ran for his life. My brother wasn't aware that this was an ongoing issue at the time, and he just thought that it was weird, and he wasn't about to try and run after this guy. Today, though, I was taking a nap at around 2 p.m., and I hear an aggressive knock on my door. It pauses for a few moments and then picks back up. While this is happening, I heard my upstairs neighbors quickly close their windows. I was tired and figured that it was this same creep, so I didn't even bother looking. After a few minutes, I heard him knocking on my neighbor's door. After that failed, he went upstairs and knocked on the 2 doors up there for a bit. After a while, the knocking stopped, and I heard my upstairs neighbors open their windows back up. I couldn't sleep anymore, so I grabbed my smokes and I headed outside. I could hear my neighbors through their open window. The little girl was asking her mum who that guy was and why he keeps doing this. And I know of him bothering them at least twice, but it could definitely be more than that. I have reported this to my landlord, but she's absolutely no help and basically just tells me to not answer the door if I feel unsafe and to call the police if it escalates. The police don't have a quick enough response time to come out here when it's happening. I did call them before, and I don't have much of a description for them to go off of. And they basically told me to not open the door if I feel unsafe and to call them if it escalates. And I mean, you would think that someone ripping my bedroom screen off would count as escalating, but I don't know. I guess not. This guy, though, has been bothering me for a little over a year now, and apparently my neighbors as well. It seems really weird for a criminal to do something like this. Just keep trying to break into the same group of apartments over and over again. And I guess that I just have no idea what he could be after.
Welcome to Sinful's Horror Stories. If you're new to the channel, please be sure to subscribe now for quality horror narrations on YouTube. Please make sure to hit the thumbs up button. Make sure to hit the bell so you're notified of all my new weekly uploads. The more likes this video gets, the more YouTube will recommend it to other people. So please be sure to like this video. Comment below and introduce yourself, and I will be sure to respond. If you want to be featured on an upcoming video, email me. My email will be in the description box below. Sit back, relax, Enjoy this video. Stay sinful. When I was 17, I worked at a growing retail chain called Five Below, which, as you could probably guess, only sold items that were $5 or less. It was in a small outdoor shopping mall in my town, and was only about a 20-minute walk from where I lived. I was often given the night shifts, working from at least 4 to 10:30 at night, and when we'd let out at the end of our shifts, I'd often find myself walking home. This usually wasn't too much of an issue, as I had to walk along the side of a fairly busy street. It connected right onto a Route 1, so there was always cars passing by no matter how late at night. Given that I was a petite girl and often mistaken for being younger than I am, it gave me a bit of comfort knowing that there was always a possible witness in case some late-night creeper decided to try something. However, the encounters I had were far more unnerving due to how innocent the man seemed at first. There was a bus stop right at the corner of the street, the one I'd have to turn on to take a quieter street. Sometimes there would be people sitting there, waiting for the bus of the evening, and sometimes a homeless man would use the bench as his bed for the night. He looked to be in his late 60s, had matted white hair, and only had an old torn blanket to keep him warm. He left his hat on the ground beside the bench, in case anyone with change would drop some in while walking past. I did feel quite bad for the guy, as I'd been in homeless situations before myself, but there wasn't much I could do besides drop in some change every once in a while. He'd usually be asleep when I'd pass by him, and if I had money, I'd drop it in. One night as I passed, he turned suddenly, facing me, and his gray eyes seemed to just look right through me. "Spare change." His voice croaked quietly, and his eyes shifted to the empty hat by the bench. I began searching my pockets but found that I had nothing to offer. I awkwardly rubbed the back of my neck and shook my head. "No, I'm sorry, I don't have any." His eyes narrowed at me and I could sense great malice behind the stare. It was so intense that it made me freeze momentarily. He snatched the hat off the ground and placed it back onto his head, grumbling angrily. He then sat up and pointed a finger at me. "Not everyone is as lucky as you, girlie." He spat and seemed to be getting himself more and more upset. My nostrils flared up and I picked up the strong scent of alcohol, but I couldn't spot a beer bottle anywhere. I guess he'd used the money people gave him earlier in the evening to drink at the bar down the street. I felt really uncomfortable and just wanted to get far away from him, so I waved to him apologetically and wished him a good night. He mumbled something in response, but I couldn't make out what it was, and as I turned onto the more secluded street, I decided I was no longer going to walk on this side of the street, at least not at the dead of night. I didn't see him again for a few days after that, and when he was there, he'd watch intently as I crossed the street. His eyes would follow me the entire time until I disappeared around the corner. Things took a turn for the worse one of my last weeks working there. I was walking home one night to find that there was construction on the side I usually took, which meant I'd have to walk right past the bus stop, and of course the old man was seated there, downing a bottle of what looked like whiskey. As my form became more visible from the lights surrounding the bus stop, he smiled, a creepy, off-putting smile. I could already feel that gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach. "Aren't you a pretty little thing?" he slurred, as it seemed he may not have registered that we interacted before. He scooted closer on the bench and I could smell the alcohol stronger now. He had to have been drinking at the bar again, and someone must have given him a bottle to go. I really couldn't be sure. In his drunken haze, he points at the familiar hat on the ground, and I already knew what he wanted. Luckily, I had about $2 in cash in my pocket. I pulled it out and threw it in, smiling awkwardly. He didn't bother looking down, and that smile he had on his face only seemed to widen. It was almost predatory, as though I was a fresh piece of meat on display at the grocery store. The feeling in the pit of my stomach told me to keep walking, and I wasn't going to ignore it. I wished him a good night and went on my way, and I felt his gaze follow as I turned the corner and onto the next street. This would have been the time where I would plug my earbuds into my ears and drown out the world on the rest of my walk home. But as I reached into my pocket, I realized I had left them at work. I was annoyed at the time, but it really was a blessing in disguise. I trudged on down the street, admiring the many leaves that scattered the ground. I was pulled from admiring the colors by a loud clinking sound. It sounded like metal hitting the pavement. I peeked over my shoulder immediately, but saw nothing. I was the only one walking. I assumed something fell into someone's driveway. I looked ahead and continued walking, this time a bit faster due to being spooked. As I got maybe another 15 or so feet, I heard another clink, except this time it was louder and closer than before. I paused and turned around swiftly, feeling that familiar feeling knot up in my stomach. There was no one on the sidewalk, no one in the driveways that I could see. My eyes began searching about, and I was becoming more and more paranoid. As I was about to give up and turn back around, I saw movement in the corner of my eye. Across the street, crouched behind a parked car, was the old man from the bus stop. His gray eyes peeked at me over the left side of the trunk, watching intently. My eyes instantly widened in horror, letting out a scream and beginning to sprint as fast as my legs would permit. I could hear loud footsteps following close behind, and I was too overcome by fear to scream again. I turned the corner onto the next street, hearing the old man scream after me. His words were slurred, and I couldn't make out what he was saying, but his voice was getting closer to me, which meant he was closing the gap between us quickly. I was starting to lose stamina and realized I might not be able to outrun him. The fear of what he was planning on doing with me brought me to tears. As I felt myself slowing down, I prayed, but wasn't sure if that would even work. I'm not a religious person by any means, but it felt like the only thing to do. And then, as though it were some kind of miracle, a car turned onto the street and began making its way down, lighting up the street beside me and behind me. The homeless man was caught dead in the headlights, stopped almost immediately. In the corner of my eyes, I saw that in his left hand, he was holding an old Swiss Army knife. The person driving must have caught on to what was going on and began beeping their horn at him, which seemed to have freaked him out. He began taking off in the opposite direction, disappearing into the dark. I took that opportunity to run across the street and all the way home, being sure to lock the door behind me once inside. Everyone was asleep in the house, and I tried to remain quiet and not wake them, but I couldn't help but eventually breaking down, letting the whole realization of the situation crash into me all at once. I was really lucky to have gotten away from him, and I had no idea what the hell he was planning on doing. I barely slept that night and told my family what had happened in the morning. My brother believed the man wanted to rob me, despite the fact I had no money on me, except the $2 I gave him. But something about that smile on his face gave me a whole different idea of what he may have wanted. I didn't see the man after that night. I assumed he picked a new bus stop to sleep at since the incident. I also no longer walked home alone either. I always had a coworker drive me home or walk with me, but I'll never forget that night. Never walk home alone. You never know who may want to join you. This actually happened to a friend of mine. She used to live in an entirely different town when she was younger, and her closet had this strange door in the back of it. Well, whether it was imagined just due to her being a child at the time, or if it really did happen, She started to hear noises coming from behind the door whenever she went to bed. She told me that several times she tried telling her parents that she was hearing these noises, but they never believed her. So some time goes by, and one day her parents get a call from the police because they just arrested a homeless man. This was not just any homeless man, though. This homeless man was living in some sort of tunnel that goes straight to that door in the back of her closet. So every once in a while, for whatever reason, this man would come through that door and watch my friend sleep in her closet. My friend was visiting family in the States. They lived in a rural community of Maine, and one morning she woke up before everyone else and decided to go for a run. After 30 minutes, she turned back and started noticing a van following a few blocks behind her. She thought it was strange, so started turning down a few streets with the van following her every move. She started sprinting and the van sped up to match her speed. She ran to the first house she could find and started banging on the door. No answer. She hopped the fence and started banging on the back door of the same home. The dog in the house started barking at her, but no one answered. She jumped into the empty pool in the backyard and hid while dialing 911. A car parked in the front of her house, and a man started calling out to her, offering her a ride home. The dog in the house was now barking like crazy, and the man left after about a minute. Police showed up and took her back to her family's place. She gave a report and they identified the van from a nearby HVAC business. It had been stolen earlier that day. This couple had a huge tree in their backyard, and it started to smell and ooze. They had arborists come in and look at the tree, but no one could figure out what was wrong. The couple decided to have the tree removed one day. When the branches started coming down, a body fell out. A homeless woman was sleeping in the tree and had died. Her body had been decomposing for ages. My friend came home from school one day to find that her house had been broken into. She decided to go inside and look around while she called her mom. She was done looking at the second floor when she made her way to the stairs. Her mom convinced her to go outside and wait for the police, who she had called. Later on, the police asked the family if they owned a crowbar. They said they didn't. They then said it looks like the offender was still in the house when she got home, and that they were waiting at the top of the stairs with the crowbar. My ex-wife and I woke up in the middle of the night to find all of our lights out in the house. We had not lost power. The living room light that we always leave on overnight had been turned off. The bathroom nightlight was removed and placed under the sink. The computer had been unplugged and the monitor cord was unplugged and neatly folded on the desk. All of the doors and windows in the house were unlocked, undamaged and standing wide open. Our bedroom door was open and the TV we always fall asleep to was turned off. Nothing was taken. Our cats were both hiding behind the refrigerator and stayed there for most of the day. Whenever someone came and knocked at the door, our larger cat would start to growl and stare at the door from then on. She no longer does this after we moved. I had awesome parents who let me sleep in the living room on weekends when I was very young, because my sister was a light sleeper and I could stay up until dawn. But of course I always ended up sleeping on the couch because Nick at night made me tired. So one night I wake up to this prickly feeling, like an instinct. Just bolted into a sitting position and stared out the front window. We lived in rural Georgia, so you can imagine the magnitude of the trees. In the perfect light cast from the moon, I see a silhouette of someone in the fucking tree. The family dog dashes to the window and is snarling into the glass. Terrified, I run into my parents' room and try to explain to my parents that there was a strange person outside. Dad grabs something for defense and darts outside with the dogs to beat the wax off the hot head. I tremble in my mom's arms until Dad comes home and says he saw no one and to go to bed. I decided to sleep in my regular bedroom. I fill in my sister in as to what happened. Dad is making regular rounds in the house with a cup of coffee. We are all still, and I finally think I can sleep. Nope, I notice the man outside my window. From what I can see in the moonlight, he gives me a shush signal and runs away. Just turns around to run a straight line away. I swear I couldn't stop crying for what felt like hours. Thank you guys for watching and listening to this video. I hope you guys enjoyed the story selection tonight. Email your true scary stories to thesinfulsavant@gmail.com. The link to my email is in the description box below as well. Be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't. And I want to say a special thank you to my true loyal followers that actually finished the entire video. This one's for you. Till we meet again, stay sinful. Ha 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 ha.